China produces nearly 8 million tons of soy sauce every year. But in Japan, some artisans spend several years on a single batch. No massive production lines, no attempt to rush the process. Instead, the soy sauce is aged in wooden barrels more than 100 years old, allowing time and a living ecosystem of microorganisms to do the rest. Today, only about 1% of Japan's soy sauce production is still aged in traditional wooden barrels like these. So what exactly happens inside them? And in an industry that produces millions of tons every year, why do some people still believe that some things simply can't be rushed? Today, Mido Explained takes you inside a 5-generation soy sauce brewery to find out. Before we step inside Yamamoto's brewery, let's take a quick look at the main ingredients behind soy sauce: soybeans, wheat, salt, and aspergillus mold, which is used to make koji. From these 4 seemingly simple ingredients, an entire ecosystem of microorganisms gets to work, driving a transformation that can take anywhere from a few months to several years. There are small breweries like Yamamoto's, where soy sauce is still aged in traditional wooden barrels. There are massive factories producing millions of bottles a year while still relying on the same natural fermentation process, only with much tighter control through modern technology. And then there is a third, much faster approach: using acid to hydrolyze plant proteins instead of waiting for fermentation. These 3 paths may be very different, but they all begin with one familiar ingredient: the soybean. Every batch of soy sauce starts with soaking soybeans until each one swells and softens, then steaming them. The high heat changes the structure of the proteins inside, making them easier for mold to break down later. Meanwhile, wheat is roasted until fragrant, then cracked open. It's the starch inside that matters most here, saved for the next stage of the process. Once both are ready, the steamed soybeans and roasted wheat are mixed together and inoculated with aspergillus mold, then moved into a room held at 25 to 35 degrees Celsius, with humidity above 90%. Within just 2 to 3 days, a layer of pale green mold covers the entire surface. This is koji. It looks like nothing more than a batch of spoiled soybeans. But hidden inside that mold are enzymes, ready to break down protein into the amino acids that create umami and turn starch into sugar to feed the microbes waiting in the next stage. At Yamamoto's brewery, koji is mixed with salt water to form moromi, then poured into wooden barrels over 100 years old, each holding more than a ton of the mixture. From this point on, most of the work is no longer in human hands. Deep within the wood grain lives a community of microbes, sustained across generations of fermentation. Over the course of 18 months, enzymes from the koji keep breaking down protein into amino acids, while sugar from the wheat feeds the microbes. The moromi slowly shifts in color, aroma, and flavor. Yasuo Yamamoto, the 5th generation to run the family brewery, checks the barrels every day using only his eyes and nose. Years of experience let him tell exactly what stage the moromi is at just from its scent. Apple-like at first, gradually turning into banana. Periodically, he and his team stir the mixture to keep the conditions ideal for fermentation. After about a year and a half, the moromi is ready to be pressed. It's wrapped in cloth, stacked in layers, and pressed for 10 days, the liquid first flowing out under its own weight before more pressure is applied. To understand why a handful of simple ingredients can produce so many layers of flavor, we need to look at what's actually forming inside the moromi. Among the amino acids produced during fermentation, one name stands out: glutamate, one of the key compounds behind umami. In 1908, Japanese scientist Kikunai Ikeda traced the distinctive taste of kombu broth back to glutamate, identifying it as the source of the flavor he named umami. But umami is only part of the story. Scientists have identified hundreds of aroma compounds in soy sauce, which together create a flavor complexity no single ingredient could produce on its own. That explains the apple scent turning into banana that Yamamoto notices every day. It's not his imagination. It's the aroma compounds inside the moromi constantly shifting through each stage of fermentation. But people learned to harness this strange process long before they knew what glutamate or microbes even were. About 2,000 years ago, during the Han Dynasty, people in China fermented beans, grains, and salt into thick pastes known collectively as jiang. Salt was a valuable commodity controlled by the state, and jiang became an important way to preserve food and add flavor to it. Believed to have traveled through Buddhist monks, the technique spread to Japan during the Kamakura period. By the Edo period, Noda had emerged as a major center of shoyu production. By the 17th century, Japanese soy sauce was already being shipped to Europe by the Dutch East India Company, turning an East Asian condiment into an international commodity centuries before modern globalization. The shift actually began before the war. In 1917, 8 soy sauce-producing families in Noda merged, laying the foundation for what would become Kikkoman. But World War II was the real turning point. Scarce raw materials forced the industry to save time and labor wherever it could. The post-war years pushed the demand for efficiency and scale even further, and wooden barrels gave way to steel tanks. But industrialization didn't mean fermentation disappeared. Kikkoman expanded globally along that same path. In 1973, the company built its first U.S. plant in Walworth, Wisconsin, now the world's largest soy sauce production facility, turning out nearly 110 million liters a year. Some of its tanks hold up to 378,000 liters, yet the mixture still ferments for 3 to 6 months. A wooden barrel holding over a ton, aged for 18 months. A steel tank holding 378,000 liters, aged for 3 to 6 months. The same biological process, controlled at 2 entirely different scales. Not every producer follows Kikkoman's path. There's a third route, using acid to hydrolyze soy protein, instead of waiting for microbes to ferment it. Soybeans are heated with hydrochloric acid at high temperatures, breaking down protein into amino acids in just a few days. It's far faster and cheaper, but the flavor comes out noticeably different from naturally fermented soy sauce. The high heat involved can also produce 3-MCPD, a compound once linked to health concerns. In 2001, the UK Food Standards Agency found that nearly a quarter of the soy sauce samples it tested exceeded Europe's safety limits, forcing the industry to adjust its processes. A year later, that rate had dropped to around 6%. The real dividing line isn't between handmade and industrial, since even Kikkoman still relies on natural fermentation. The real question is how far people can push a biological process to go faster, before they have to replace it with something else entirely. Against that backdrop, brewers like Yamamoto occupy a very small corner. Only about 1% of Japanese soy sauce is still aged in traditional wooden barrels. And Shotoshima, where he lives, is believed to hold most of the roughly 3,000 Kyoke barrels left in the country. For Yamamoto, keeping these barrels running isn't just a business. He taught himself barrel making after most Kyoke craftsmen in Japan had already given up the trade. And every year he runs workshops, inviting people from around the world to learn the craft and taste a flavor that, to him, can't be separated from the wood. He compares his work to a relay race. But what he's passing on isn't just a craft. People have never truly made soy sauce. They've only created the environment for microbes to do it. And that's exactly what Yamamoto is leaving for those who come after him. A living environment still unfolding inside every barrel. A 150-year-old wooden barrel. A steel tank holding nearly 100,000 gallons. The same basic principle, but two completely different ways of doing it. Inside that wooden barrel lives a community of microorganisms preserved through batch after batch of fermentation. Something Yamamoto sees as his family's true legacy. Not a technique or a recipe, but a living ecosystem passed down through generations. In a world that is always looking for ways to make things faster, this story leaves us with a simple question. What are the things that only time can create? Perhaps that is why, in an industry producing millions of tons every year, there is still 1% that chooses not to rush.